So my name is Jocelyn Ramirez, and I am the chef and founder of Todo Verde. I want to thank you all for checking out this class today. And I started Todo Verde back in 2015 because I wanted to create more access to plant-based meals that still felt like they were relevant to what my family had grown up eating. So I'm half Mexican, half Ecuadorian. Mexican on my mom's side, which means like all the food, most of the food that was made came from my mom's side of the family. She's from Zacatecas, Mexico. And the dish that we're making today actually is a dish from Guadalajara. So Guadalajara is not too far. Oh, I see the hands raising. Not too far off from Zacatecas. Although I did have a partner in the past and his family was from Guadalajara. So I got to learn a lot from his grandmother on cooking a lot of these dishes and have visited Guadalajara, and I'm such a fan of the food there. And so I'm happy to be sharing this recipe with you all today. And we're gonna get right into it just to make sure we have enough time to cover everything. And there are a couple of elements here that we'll be working on. So I'm gonna start off with showing you how I break down jackfruit, just to make sure that you have enough time in the process to break your jackfruit down. And I've already gotten a little bit of a head start in that I opened up 3 cans of young green jackfruit, and I opened them up and I tossed it in a strainer to remove all of the liquid or the brine that it's in. And I gave it a really good rinse, and I squeezed all the liquid out of it with my hands. So I rinsed off all that brine as much as I could, and then I literally hand squeezed it. And I'll show you, I have a few bits here that I haven't broken down yet, and I'll show you how I broke that down. But that way you can get a little bit of a head start. And then I'll show you how I further break it down with my knife to make sure that we use every single piece of that jackfruit. And then we'll get into how we make the salsa that coats the torta ahogada. And the sauce that we're making today is pretty simple. I wanted to keep it simple because as long as you know how to make a good base, you can add a little bit more of this, a little bit more of that, and make it even more so your own. There's some torta ahogada recipes where the salsa calls for some cloves, a little bit of cumino, a little bit of allspice. You can definitely add a few more of those things if you have them in your cupboard. But what we're making today is a pretty simple, straightforward salsa with guajillo chiles, with chile de árbol, with onion, garlic. We're going to be using water to break that down. We have some tomatoes in there. And then you'll see, you know, that sometimes torta ahogadas, depending on the chef or the family, might call for like 30 chile de árbol. And chile de árbol, if you've never had one before, is really, really spicy. And so some tortas ahogadas, they have like a more mild tomato sauce that they put over the top. And then if you want it spicy, they'll pour over this chile de árbol sauce, which is super bright red, and definitely gives it a kick where you definitely need to have a drink nearby. And it's a little mixture of like, it hurts so good, you know? But tortas ahogadas are so delicious, and there's a few spots in LA where I've gotten the pleasure of eating them back in the days when I used to eat meat. And as I've transitioned to vegetarian and now vegan, I still want to have that torta ahogada, but I just want to be able to have it with something like a jackfruit. And so I'll show you, if you've never made jackfruit before, you're going to leave here knowing the breakdown of how to make it. And then you can add this jackfruit to pozole, you can make tacos, you can add it to a chile verde for tostadas, you can add it to so many things. It's very versatile. So let's go ahead and get started with that. And then the last thing I'll mention is as those two things are cooking off, as my jackfruit is searing, as my salsa de tomate is simmering, I'll show you just how I cook some beans, and I'll blend them up to make them a pretty smooth puree. And then I'll talk a little bit about the pickled onions that I made and sort of the recipe that I like to go by, and we'll start to piece it all together. So let's get into this jackfruit. And I'm gonna bring my cutting board over and start to show you here. And so again, I have 3 cans of this young green jackfruit. And I forgot to turn on this light. Give me a second here. I have a light on my computer. There we go. All right, there we go. I'm like all the lights, my at-home studio now, recording studio. All right, so I have 3 cans of young green jackfruit, and it's young green, essentially, if you've never seen a jackfruit, they sell them a lot at Asian markets and sometimes now at health food stores, but it's this really huge fruit. It grows on trees, surprisingly. It's one of the biggest fruits that you can buy. It's sometimes much larger than even a watermelon. It has this green spikes all over it. And it's typically grown in tropical areas like India, Thailand, Mexico. And by the time it gets imported here as a fresh fruit, you're typically going to have it already ripe to a certain extent, like the sugars have developed, which means that it doesn't really work out very well for these savory dishes. So you want to use either a canned version, or sometimes you see them in a pouch, or I've seen it jarred in a variety of different ways. And I like to get just a very simple one, because sometimes the ones in the pouch already have some seasoning, like there's some companies that have already flavored it. Just for me, the best way is to get the young green jackfruit by itself. No seasoning, no flavor. I like to add everything myself. And when you open it up out of the can, you're going to want to give it a good rinse. Throw it in a strainer to get all that liquid out, because it's in a liquid in here. And you're going to want to strain that out, give it a good rinse. And then even if I squeeze it a little bit, there's still juice in here that you can see running down. But before I show you that, I want to show you just kind of the anatomy of a jackfruit. And so you'll see from this line down, there's this like what I call a core piece that just is a little bit firm to the touch, doesn't really break down. I mean, I can tear it a little bit, but it's essentially like a pretty firm little chunk. And then there's this top part which shreds really easily with my fingers, and you can see how much as I shred it, it starts to look like a pulled chicken or pulled pork consistency that as I cook it will continue to look more and more like a meat consistency. And so what I want to do is separate this bottom core from the top using a knife. And then I want to mince up this core part, because this still tastes just like this. I've seen people throw this away, and you're just wasting food at that point, because this still is the same neutral flavor. It's just not the texture that you're looking for. So what I'll do is I'll put some jackfruit in my hands, and I'll just squeeze as much of this liquid out as I can. And you're going to do this for all 3 cans that you have. And I'll set this aside. I'll grab the rest of my jackfruit here and just squeeze as much as I can out. And it has quite a bit of liquid in here. I find that, you know, I've seen videos where people just literally throw the whole chunks in a pan and like break it up with a spoon. I don't recommend that. I think the squeezing component, although it takes a little bit more time, is super important, because you're getting all that brine out. Like I've heard people say, oh, I don't like jackfruit because it tastes like brine. Well, what I would do is just, you know, do this technique of squeezing as much of the liquid out of it, because then your seasoning is going to coat this jackfruit so much more so, because it doesn't have all this water in it. And then in addition to that, if you wanted to take this even a step further, you could put this squeezed jackfruit in a container with water and let it sit for a couple hours, and then let some of that brine continue to come out. Although I will say, like for me personally, I think it's fine. I can already, like, it's a fruit, so I can like literally eat it right now and taste it. And because I've squeezed it, I mean, it has a very neutral flavor, but it's not like I taste anything that's like, OMG, that the flavor's so strong of a brine or anything like that. It's very, very neutral. And you can see that I have quite a bit of water that came out of that. So I'll go ahead and put this aside, and let me show you how I break this down. So I essentially have 3 piles, a pile that needs to get broken down, and then a pile of these cores. So I'll just cut off right at where the line is, where the core meets the shreddy parts. So this is that huge chunk. And the reason I want to break this down is because, you know, if I were to season this really well, it'll be fine on the outside, but when I take a bite into this, it's going to be really bland in the middle. And then this shreddy part, I like to just kind of push and check if there's any of these, what I call seed pods. Well, they are seeds. So these like seed pods that are in here. And I just like to take those out because those also don't look like meat. And I want my jackfruit to look as much like meat as possible. This is how you fool your family members, seriously. These seed pods are really small, but I'll see if any of the other ones here have a bigger one. And so these seeds are gonna go together with that core. And I'll show you how I mince that up shortly. And then you see here my pile that I'm starting of the jackfruit is essentially almost ready to go. It's already just the shreddy top part that already has the consistency that I'm looking for. So I'm cutting off my core here. Here's a big seed pod that I can show you. And so again, for me, it's more of like this consistency. I want it to all be kind of a similar shape or size. And this big, you know, seed is not the look that I'm going for. So this one has a couple of big ones here, right? And I'll add those to my pile of the cores. So I have my 3 piles going right now, which is trying to get mixed up here. There we go. So cores and seed pods, ready to go jackfruit. And these are the last couple bits I have to break down. So as folks are cooking along, it's gonna take you a little while to break down through this jackfruit, but it's totally okay. And if there's multiple hands working on this, it goes so much faster. And the other thing that I'll mention, I'm using a knife here to break down my jackfruit. I'm gonna mince it up by knife. But if you have a food processor, you can do this a lot faster. So I would still recommend, if you have a food processor, to do this step where you separate the seeds from and the cores from the rest of the jackfruit, because I want this texture of the shred, you know, the shreddable bits of jackfruit. I want that texture. It's really nice. If I were to throw, you know, the jackfruit directly from the can, like opening it and then throwing it on the food processor, it would really mince up this shreddy part of jackfruit that I want. So what I would throw in the food processor is just the seeds and the pods, or the cores, just those bits that I want to break down further. And that's what we do at our kitchen in Tolo Verde. So we go through each individual piece of jackfruit is cut by hand, and then we throw the rest in a big food processor. It's like an industrial food processor. So all you want to do is use a chef's knife, making sure that you have your thumb on one side, your index finger on another side of the base of the knife, and fingers up above. So don't hold on to the jackfruit. They're gonna move all over the place. Just get your fingers out of the way, put them on the top of the blade, and just run your knife through the jackfruit. And so all I'm doing is I'm trying to break it down. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I'm trying to break it down to a point where my jackfruit starts to kind of blend in to the size that I want of like the shreddable pieces, where it's like not a huge chunk anymore, not a huge seed, that it's kind of minced up to just kind of a rough mince. And I'm just about there. I just have a couple big pieces here. All right, and that's more or less the consistency that we're looking for there. So now I know that as I season my jackfruit, the seasoning is gonna get into every little tiny piece of it. So I'm not gonna have any bland areas of my jackfruit. It's all gonna be coated nicely in my seasoning. So I'm gonna go ahead and add this to my bowl. And then I'll show you kind of the last step of prepping the jackfruit, aside from seasoning it. And I also have on my stove a skillet that's preheating. It's on the lowest setting on my stove. And I have a small pot of water with 4 cups of water in it. You can see, if you have it on gallery view, you might be able to see my stove here. And so I have them both on the lowest setting, and I'll get to it in a moment, but I just have it preheating so I don't have to wait for it. It's waiting for me to be ready. And I don't know why I washed my hands, because I'm still gonna put my hands right into the jackfruit right now and show you one last thing. Okay, so here are all the bits that I broke down with my knife, or you can do with your food processor. And here are all the nice pieces that have that texture that I'm talking about, that meaty texture. The last thing I'm gonna do is I'm going to use my hands to just break this down. So I don't want, you know, this big chunk here. I wanna use my fingers to just break it down so it's lots of little pieces. And so I'll just run my hands through this pretty quickly. And if you see me make jackfruit before, it's a, you know, similar or same technique most of the time. I've never done jackfruit where it's like I sear the whole thing and keep it whole. I always break it down. So here's another seed pod that I found. I'll just use my fingers to kind of break that down a little bit. So I just broke that down until it all kind of starts to blend in together and just really has this meaty consistency that we're looking for. And I've done events with Todo Verde where people see our jackfruit, you know, like we might be doing like a buffet setup or something, and people will see our jackfruit and they're like, oh, I'm vegetarian, I'll take everything else you have except that chicken there, or except that pork there. And they really think that it's a me. And we have to say, oh, actually, like, we're all vegan. Everything that we do is all plant-based, and they're shocked by it. So, you know, jackfruit is definitely having a moment right now. And I think that a lot of people are excited about it. One thing I will say about jackfruit is that it's not a exact protein replacement for, you know, like a chicken or pork. So, you know, you're not going to get protein from this really. It's actually really low in protein, but it's high in fiber, high in vitamin C. So there are other things that it's really good for. But you want to make sure that you're just, you know, adding some beans, adding some brown rice, adding some other elements throughout the day to make sure that you're getting a good amount of protein source, which isn't a problem, right? If you eat a lot of leafy greens, if you eat lots of legumes, seeds, all that good stuff, you'll still get what you need in terms of protein. All right. So I have my bowl of jackfruit here that's broken down, and I'm gonna season it up. So for my jackfruit, I like to always use a lot of cumin. I have here some ground cumin. If you had seeds, you can just grind up the seeds and add that. You know, if you do have seeds, another nice touch could even be to like toast the seeds and then grind them and add them. So I have 2 tablespoons, which is quite a lot. But again, this is like a very neutral flavor. And so the cumin is going to give me like a nice depth of flavor, a little bit of smokiness in the background. So I'm going to go ahead and add that. And I have also some fresh cracked pepper back here. So I'll go ahead and add that cumino there. And then the other thing I'm going to add is I have a 1/2 cup of oil. And it may seem like a lot, but oil is something that jackfruit doesn't have because it is a fruit. So you need to be able to add some fat to it. And I'm personally here at home really into using grapeseed oil for cooking because it has a higher smoke point. I use olive oil mostly for cold foods. I have extra virgin olive oil. If you only have extra virgin olive oil or something like that, which is what I think most people have at home, you can definitely use it. It'll be fine. But it's just a more expensive oil for cooking. It's intended more to be for eating cold. So, and then alternatively, you could also use just not virgin, but just olive oil, just regular olive oil for cooking as well too. With Todo Verde, we use rice bran oil for our cooking. So I'm gonna go ahead and just pour that whole 1/2 cup. Let me grab a spatula. Oops. I have here my 1/2 cup of oil. It's all going in. And then I'm gonna add some lemon juice and some salt. So the recipe calls for about 2 to 4 tablespoons of lemon juice. So that's really your call. I love things that are really acidic. My partner's always like, too much lemon. Sometimes I'm like, what? There's no such thing as too much lemon. Poor thing, you know? but I just love lemon so much. It makes things shine so much brighter. So I have my lemon squeezer. Typically, if you have a nice juicy lemon, a half of a lemon will be about 2 tablespoons of juice. So 1 lemon would be your full 4 tablespoons. I'm gonna start with my 2, and then as it's cooking, I'll give it a taste and see if it needs a little bit more lemon juice, and I can hit it with more as it's cooking. So that's just a good tip, is like you can always add as you go if you feel like it needs a little bit more something. If you wanted, you know, still some of that brightness of the citrus, but maybe the lemon juice is too acidic, you can also add some orange juice or whatever other citrus you have on hand. I haven't tried it with grapefruit personally. I wonder what that would be like, but I have definitely used like orange, mandarin, things like that. And the last thing I'm using here is salt, and I have some kosher salt here. It'll be salt to taste. So however salty your salt is, that's how much you'll go by. And again, you know, add a little bit to start off, and you can always taste as you go. And all I'm gonna do is mix this up and make sure that I get that nice cumin, spice rub. And you can add more to this too. So this is a very, very basic, easy jackfruit. If you had, you know, crushed red pepper flakes, which I'm not adding because obviously the salsa that we're adding over the torta is already gonna have some chile. But if you wanted this to also have a little bit of a kick to it, you could add some pepper flakes, red crushed pepper flakes. You could add some mushroom powder. You could add a little dash of liquid aminos or soy sauce for umami. You could add so much more to this jackfruit to make it even more flavorful. But this is your base. And you can taste this, and then next time you make it, you could be like, ooh, I'm gonna, you know, I have a little bit of this and that. I'm gonna add a little bit of oregano. Maybe I'll add a little thyme. Maybe I'll add a little bit more of this or that. So there's my jackfruit. It's essentially pretty ready to go. And I have that skillet that I mentioned that is preheated. I have it on super low. I'm gonna turn it up just slightly. But before I add my jackfruit to it, just in, you know, thinking about using as few pans as possible, I'm gonna add my chiles that I wanna toast before I go ahead and add the jackfruit to that same skillet. And so I have here, and let me see what this says. There we go. So I have here some chiles. I have 4 guajillo chiles, which are these like long and narrow chiles. Let me see if I can back up a little bit. These long and narrow chiles that are typically like a nice deep red color. And I want them to just toast. You can either add a tiny bit of oil and like sear them in a little oil. It'll go a lot faster, like pan fry them, or you can just dry toast them. And so again, this skillet has been on, so it's nice and hot. And I'm just gonna add, I could hear a little bit of sizzling happening there. And all I did was I had previously taken out the stem. I took all the seeds out and I gave them a nice rinse. And so because they have a little bit of water on them from the rinse is the sizzling that you can hear. And I also have here just 4 chile de árbol. Chile de árbol are really spicy. They're gonna cook a little bit faster than my guajillos. So I'm gonna make sure that I keep an eye on them. And I'm just gonna cook them enough until they get a little bit of char on them. Not too much. You don't want them to blacken to the point where they get really bitter. You just wanna blacken them slightly to just pretty much heat them up, wake them up. You're waking up the oils here. You're like reawakening the chile. And one other thing I'll mention too is like when you're using dried chiles, notice that like, I mean, these chiles are pretty pliable. The fresher the dried chiles are, the more you'll be able to kind of get them to move around without breaking them so much. These chile de árbol, actually, I've had them for a little while because I don't use a lot of chile de árbol because they are spicy. Like I'll use like 1 or 2 at a time. Not like, you know, some of these Torta Ahogada recipes where people are using like 30 at a time. And so I don't buy these as often. And so these are a little bit more kind of brittle, like they're easier to break, you know. I could already start to smell the aroma of the chiles toasting. There's a little bit of smokiness that's coming out. And so I'm gonna go ahead and flip these over.
Jocelyn, do you mind shifting your camera a little bit to the right? Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. All right, so you can see here, I'm like, where exactly is there it is. Oh yeah, my phone camera's right there. So see a little bit of that blackening, but I don't want them to get black to the point where they're completely burned. Just enough to, again, give them that little bit of char. And like I mentioned, I have a pot of water back here that I've had the water on for the whole time this class has been going. And the water's hot. The water's really hot. And I'm actually gonna go ahead and turn it off because I just wanted it to be hot to the point where it's gonna help get my chiles to break down a little bit faster, but not to the point where it doesn't need to be boiling, essentially. So these just need another few seconds. And again, you can see that smokiness happening. Actually, these are pretty ready to go. Let me actually, my hot point, because I move my pan so close to the camera, is towards the back here, because my flame is right here. And so I'm just gonna put my chile de árbol back here just to kind of get them to wake up a little bit more. These guajillo chiles, I'm gonna go ahead and add them to this pot of water that I have right here. So you can see just a hot steaming pot of water. And I'm gonna go ahead and add those there. And so you can use room temp water if that's what you had, which is totally fine. The hot water helps it go a little bit faster, makes them softer a little bit faster. And so again, all you're looking for is a little bit of a blackening to start happening, but not, I'm actually blocking it with the tongs there, but not enough to actually burn them completely. All right, so I am gonna go ahead and add these chiles to my water. And I'm just gonna make sure that they are fully submerged. And I'm gonna let those hang out in there for a little while, maybe about 5 to 10 minutes or so. And so while that's going, I'm gonna bring you up and close to my skillet here. There we go. And I'm gonna bring over my jackfruit. So I'm gonna, let me get these 2 chile seeds out of here. I'm gonna just put my jackfruit directly into the skillet. There we go. So I just want to get every little last bit. I love using silicone spatulas in the kitchen because you're able to get every little tiny piece out of the bowl. It almost cleans it for you. Almost. If only it were that easy, right? All right, so I have this on about a medium heat. And this is gonna take about 20 to 25 minutes to cook. And the cooking time really varies depending on your preference. So if you love a really crispy jackfruit, which I do, then I actually cook it for a little while longer. But at about 20 to 25 minutes, you can see the consistency and see if it's like soft enough, if the flavors have melded enough. It should have some browning that's occurred, a little bit of crispiness. If you need more crisping and it's not quite happening, it could be because your jackfruit needs a little bit more oil. So I'm using a cast iron skillet, which I love to use obviously at home. And I like it because the cast iron also has some seasoning, which means it kind of retains a little bit of the oil that I've used over time in cooking. But if you're using something that doesn't have any of that seasoning, for example, if you were using a stainless steel skillet, you might have a little bit more sticking that happens, like the jackfruit might stick to the bottom of your pan, or you might see that you need a little bit more oil here and there. You can always add a little bit more as needed. And all you're gonna wanna do is, if it's on this medium heat, you don't have to necessarily babysit it and that you're like checking it every few seconds. You can give it a minute or two and then come over and just turn whatever's on the bottom and bring it to the surface. And that way you have, you know, the pieces of jackfruit that haven't really touched the hot bottom, the surface, kind of falling to that bottom, and you're just kind of rearranging it as you go every couple minutes or so to make sure that you're getting that nice browning and it's cooking evenly. If you were to walk away from this, I've seen some people who are in a rush and they want to cook it on super high heat, or maybe they didn't preheat their skillet and they had it on super high and they want to like hurry up and get the pan hot, but then it gets like too hot. You could burn your jackfruit, although I will say that jackfruit's pretty resilient in that even if you get a little blackness on there, if it's not like completely burnt to a crisp, you could kind of just still like mix it throughout. And I find that there's no bitterness that comes from slightly burning the jackfruit. Trust, I've cooked so much jackfruit and I've definitely burned some of the jackfruit, but it's definitely resilient that you can like mix it, and it just kind of mellows that out. It's almost as if like you were, grilling like a piece of meat or something and you kind of went overboard on searing it, but it doesn't mean like it's a total lost cause. Like if you, were to then add some wine to the pan or something, you can kind of try to save it. Same thing goes here. I find that jackfruit's really resilient. So that's going to be cooking. I'm going to be coming back and forth to it. And then let's talk a little bit more about our chiles and our sauce. So let me get rid of this lemon. And we're going to come to talk about the other elements of our sauce, which are our tomatoes. So right now we have our guajillos and our chile de árbol going. And then I have here our globe tomatoes. And globe tomatoes are also called beefsteak tomatoes. They're these large round tomatoes and you can cut them in slices. They're typically what will be in a burger. And then I also had these other tomatoes, which are like little baby Roma ones, which I'm going to use just to complete the 4 full tomatoes. And I just cut off a piece because I smushed it with other stuff in my groceries yesterday and they were really squishy right here. So I just went ahead and tossed those pieces. But the rest of the tomato, I just bought these yesterday. They were in good shape, but I just really smushed them pretty bad. And so all I'm going to do is give these like a very rough chop, and I'm going to add them to my blender. Technically, they're going to cook when I add them to the pot with the tomato and the garlic and all these things. So I like to just blend it raw and know that it's going to cook in the pot once it's all blended together. I know for some recipes and some people generally like to cook their tomatoes. I've also seen people peel, like they'll boil the tomatoes and the peel kind of like almost like bursts open and they take the skin off of the tomato. And so, I mean, people do this all different kinds of ways. I think it's fine to eat the skin. Obviously, we eat the skin of tomatoes all the time. I don't think it's terrible at all. So I just prefer to just keep it all together like this and blend it up. And so I'm just gonna put that on the flat surface, cut it in half. You could get rid of that little piece where the stem comes out by just cutting it off. I'm fine with it. It's gonna get all blended up. At the kitchen, we have like one of those little, it's like a little tool to just scoop out this section of the tomato that we do for all of our like guacamoles and things like that, and our ceviches. So I'm just cutting this into quarters. It's gonna go in the blender. I have a pretty powerful blender. I have a Vitamix that I'm using, which is my tool of preference for blending. If you could use a hand blender if you had one. I'm gonna use my hand blender in a little bit for the beans, which I'll show you. A food processor could get a little bit messy because food processors are more meant to chop rather than blend, and then also you might have quite a bit of liquid in there because of the tomato, so it could get a little messy. So just giving these all a little bit of breaking down. You could break it down further If you had a regular home blender, you can also, you know, chop this up a little bit more. But because I have a Vitamix, it should be fine to leave them in this size. And so let me go ahead and add these tomatoes to my blender. And then the other thing that I'm going to be adding here is some onion and garlic. And so onion and garlic is something I use not all the time. It really depends on the dish. Like if I find that, you know, like it really needs it, I'll go ahead and add it. But surprisingly, not a lot of people ever notice that I don't use a lot of onion and garlic because I like to go pretty hard on my seasoning and spices. And so it's not something that you really truly miss. In this case, I do find that it gives it a little bit of this like, it reminds me a little bit of the nostalgic flavors of, for example, like a sopa de fideo or something like that. So I'm just gonna give this a just little rough chop, add it to my blender. And then I have here, that was a quarter of an onion, and I'm using a red onion because I used the rest of the red onion that I'm going to show you in a second to pickle, but you can use a yellow onion. And then I have here 3 cloves of garlic. One of the cloves was kind of small, so I threw in an extra one. So technically it's like 4, one got crushed up. Ooh, and one piece fell over, but it's okay. And so I have here tomatoes, onion, garlic. I'm going to add some salt. Salt to taste. I'm going to add a couple pinches here. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab my, let me check on my jackfruit for just a moment to make sure I'm not burning anything down here. Move that to later, there we go. And so you can see a little bit of browning is occurring. I think that this jackfruit for me could use a little bit more oil. I wanted to have like sort of a lusciousness of like when you have a carnitas. Carnitas are cooked in lard, you know, they're cooked in their own fat. So you want to have a little bit of that sort of fat content to it. So I'm going to just add, I added probably about 3 tablespoons there of oil. But again, add it as you go. So if you see, oh, it looks a little dried out or it's not really crispy enough for me, that's when you hit it with a little bit more oil. So you kind of have to see how it's looking and then adjust as needed. All right, so that's looking good. I'll let that keep cooking. And then you can see here that my chiles have started to soften up. They look a lot softer and they're really starting to absorb some of that water. And so all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab my tongs. I'm gonna grab my towel here to grab the, here we go. So I'm just going to take my chiles out of the pot and I'm gonna add them to my blender. And then the last thing that this blender needs is about half a cup of this water. And actually, let me grab my measuring cup. This is pretty hot. Let me give that a rinse. This is what I used to measure the oil. So it has a little bit of oil in here, but that's totally okay. So I have about half a cup of the water. Let me add a little bit more. And you can add more as needed. So if you see that this sauce feels really thick, then you can always add more. I might need more because I added the 4 tomatoes and they were pretty big, but I want to have a good amount of this salsa. And so there's a little bit of like this kind of refinement. You have to add a little bit more depending on the size of your size of tomatoes might be very different than mine. Yours might be slightly smaller globe tomatoes. So you start with the half cup, you kind of see how it blends up. We'll see the consistency and then we can add more liquid as needed. And I'm going to use that same liquid from the chiles because that liquid has flavor. So I don't want to just use regular water. I want to use this like chile flavored water. So I'm gonna go ahead and add my lid, my Vitamix lid with a tamper, which I love because I'm gonna be able to scrape down the sides as I blend. All right, I'm gonna blend this really well. Easy. All right, so I'm just blending until I get a really, really smooth salsa here. Let me show you the consistency. So it's like a nice, almost runny salsa, which is fine because it's still gonna get cooked. It's gonna cook down slightly. Giving it a taste. And it's gonna taste different as it cooks too. So just add a little bit more salt. But that's really yummy. And it's so simple, but it's so delicious. And again, the flavor for me right now is just, I can taste a little bit of the kick from the chile de árbol, but it's still pretty mild. So this is something that most people will be able to eat with no problem. But if you love spiciness, you can definitely add more chiles to this. But again, this is a base for you to just, I'm just gonna give that salt a quick little blitz. And I'm gonna add this to the pot that I have. And as it cooks, I wanna keep that water that I used to rehydrate the chile. I'm just gonna pour my water into the bowl that I had my tomatoes in. And so if I notice that my dish, my salsa needs a little bit more water, I'll go ahead and add a little bit more of that chile water to it. So right now, I'm gonna come back to my stove here and I'm going to just go ahead and pour, and let me see if I can lift this up slightly so you can see even more of my stove. There we go. And I'll show you the inside right now, but I'm just gonna pour my sauce back into this pot that I used to soak the chiles. And I can already tell you that this is gonna slightly reduce down. And so I'll likely end up using a little bit more of that water that I used for the, to rehydrate the chiles. So, and I'm just gonna use a spatula here. I'm using that one. I have another one here to just scrape out every little last bit of this chile, of the salsa out of my blender. And so, like I was mentioning earlier, you could use, you know, a few more ingredients in here if you wanted to. You could keep it pretty simple and classic this way, and just like it's tomato. For some people, they don't even use tomato. It's straight up chile, just chile de árbol with onion and garlic, water. It's very spicy. For me, I mean, I used to eat that back in the day. It's delicious, but it feels like borderline, like, what am I doing to myself? You know, because it's a painful experience of eating, but it's kind of a fun experience too. But you're welcome to adjust the sauce however you need to. So ways that you might adjust are you might add a little bit of cloves to the blender, like even 2-3 pieces of cloves blend it in there. We'll add a little something in the background where you're like, oh, I can taste that hint of clove in there, that something in the background that I'm not quite sure what it is. Or allspice can also do that. You can add more chile de árbol, so many things. So you can add a little bit of cumin to kind of match the flavor of the jackfruit. But remember that the jackfruit also has quite a bit of cumin, and the sauce is meant to work together, to be like a play together with the other flavors. So you don't want to add too much cumin to your salsa because the jackfruit already has so much of it that it might be overpowering like a whole cumin dish. So find the notes that will marry well so that when you eat it all together, it has like a nice balance. So as that's going, I'm gonna kind of be going back and forth and checking on this. And actually my back burner is not on. So let me make sure that's on. And I have this sauce just back here. I'm gonna have it cooking here for at least a good 10 minutes on just like a medium low heat. And I'll come and check on it. Let me check on my jackfruit once again. And if you wanna check this out, I have a nice bit of browning here that's starting to happen. So I just flip that over. Let's see if I can get this. Oh, let me go back. There we go. All right. So you can see here these nice bits of browning jackfruit that are happening as I turn it over. So that's the type of jackfruit crisp that I'm looking for. And I want that to happen a lot more throughout. And the way that that's going to happen and work evenly is if I keep just making sure that I'm mixing it and turning it and making sure that it's cooking all evenly. All right. And I'm going to grab a couple more lemons. And let me come back to my cutting board. Let me grab those couple more lemons. Actually, oh, here's one, another half. I could have swore, there we go. All right, so I have quite a few lemons here. I even have a blood orange that I got from Perfect Produce that I might add to this. So essentially, I just wanted to show you in a nutshell what I add to these onions. And I already started it just because I wasn't sure what my timing was gonna look like. But I have here just a deli cup. And I used 1/4 of this red onion for my, for the actual salsa that's in the pot on the stove. And then the rest of the onion, the 3/4 of it, I just sliced up and I added it here to a deli cup with a bay leaf or two. I added some salt, a nice amount of salt. I added some oregano, some black pepper, some crushed red chili flakes. And you can add so much more to this. You can also add like cloves and allspice and different things if you're gonna have this sitting in your fridge for a couple weeks. This is what I recommend, like anytime you have a lot of onions, like I actually have another onion that I might chop up and add to this, because once you bring the lemon juice and the vinegar to it, it starts to kind of break down the onion and it makes it really soft and pliable, and it'll last in your fridge a lot longer because of the acid. And so I already added a couple of tablespoons or so of apple cider vinegar to this, and I'm just gonna add some lemon juice and give it a little bit of time to just sit and have the flavors meld together. And so I like to do this so that it's not just onions by themselves, but that those onions get a little bit of time to break down. I'm also not a huge fan of just raw onion, but if it's pickles or if it gets this chance to sit in the acidity of lemon juice, then I actually do enjoy it a little bit more. So all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab my lemon squeezer. I'm gonna add the juice of a lemon and try to get all that juice out of there. So I like to squeeze and then turn it, and you get a little bit more that was like sitting on the top. And then sometimes there's still a little bit of juice in there. So I'll just like turn it, give it another little squeeze. All right. You could also add lemon zest to this. That could be another interesting component of it. So it'll also help to brighten it up and give it some nice, a nice look too, with that nice contrast of the red onions with the, although the red onions would probably paint the yellow, the little yellow bits of the lemon. All right. And I'm gonna actually use my knife here to open up this last one that I have here, which is pretty big. I don't think it's gonna fit in my lemon squeezer. We'll see right now. I'm gonna start doing like this, doing this to help break it down. And for the vinegar, I added a few tablespoons, like 2 to 3 tablespoons. If you were not using lemon juice, another quick pickle that we do mostly with radishes at the kitchen is if you had a pot, a small pot, and you did equal parts water with equal parts vinegar. We typically just use like white vinegar. You could use an apple cider vinegar. And then you flavor that water with whole peppercorns, whole black peppercorns, some chili flakes, some salt. What else could you do? Chili flakes, salt, peppercorns, bay leaves. I think that's all we tend to add to it. And then you bring that to a boil. And then once it comes to a boil, you turn off the heat and you add your pieces of radishes, or you could have your radishes in a glass jar. We use deli cups, so I like to put the radishes in the pot and then let that cool down, and then put them in these deli cups because I don't like to put like boiling liquid in there. And let those sit, and it's such a delicious quick pickle. And you can do that with your onions too. We mostly do radishes at the kitchen.
Jocelyn, could you repeat what spices are in that deli cup again?
Sure, I have a few pinches of oregano, a few pinches of crushed red pepper flakes. I have a couple of bay leaves, some salt, pepper, and some apple cider vinegar. And you can see that it has quite a bit of liquid in there now. And so you can use a spoon to just mix that around and make sure that you get all the bits of onion coated with that juice. And it also will break down your, because right now the onion is going to be quite hard because it's so raw, but it's almost like a ceviche in that like the acidity will kind of cook your onion a little bit, and it'll make it like really soft and pliable. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a spoon. I was just checking on my jackfruit. My salsa is taking a while. Let me slightly turn up the heat to get that to warm up. Oh, I see the little bubbling happening there. We'll take a look at that in a second. So all I'm doing is just mixing this all up. And I'm also trying to gently, like if I had some pieces of onion that were, the slices are still holding together, I'm using my spoon to kind of help separate those without really like, you know, cutting them up or anything like that. I'm just trying to separate it so that I can get all that juice and the vinegar and everything to coat every little last piece of that onion. And the more you let this sit, the better. So this will end up looking, I have very little left of it, but I made this just a couple weekends ago, and it's still in my fridge and it's so good. And I have here, it's mostly the juice that's left, but you can see a couple of pieces that are super vibrant pink of the onion. Here, I can pull some up this way. And so they're super soft. I also added jalapenos in this case because I got a box of produce delivered to me, and I asked for a pound of jalapenos and asked me why they sent me like 40 jalapenos. So I was putting jalapenos in everything essentially for a couple weeks. And the rest I've roasted them. I roasted them and then I added them in a deli cup in the freezer just so I have extra. But I really love the texture of these like really soft onions that have been essentially cooking in the citrus. And so you could eat these other ones now if you wanted to, but the more that you let them sit, the better it will be. And I'm actually making mole tomorrow. And again, I'm not a huge fan of like eating onion and garlic all the time. I think that they're medicine, essentially. They're medicinal plants. And I think that we should really eat them when we feel like we need a little bit of a boost of immunity. But when I eat mole, this is one thing that I love more than anything. It's this juice. I love the lemon juice with the apple cider vinegar flavored with the onion that's like cooking in there. That juice on mole colorado specifically, is like everything. So yeah, so good. So I'm gonna go ahead and leave my sort of macerated onions to just hang out until we're ready. And I try to, when I put them in the fridge, I try to make sure that they're mostly all like in as much of the liquid as possible. So at first it seemed like it wasn't enough liquid for all the onion, but you're gonna find that after, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, the onions are gonna be so soft that they're all in the liquid. So they'll break down as we go. All right, so I'm gonna just set this aside for now. Let's come back to the stove here. All right, so you can see here that my jackfruit is getting really crispy now. And if you see any big chunks that are still emerging from the pile here, you can use the back of your spoon or your spatula to break them down. But we mostly did that work at the beginning. And so check out that nice browning that's happening. That's what we're looking for. And so, at this point, even a little bit earlier, if you wanted to, this is where I mentioned, like, this is now a personal preference. Somebody might be like, this is perfect. I'm good to eat tacos. I'm good to start making my torta. For me, I'm like, I want more of that browning to happen. So I would just still leave this for just a few more minutes. And to be honest, I'm gonna add just a touch more of oil just to help that crisping happen. Maybe another couple tablespoons. And that's gonna get the jackfruit even more crispy. And, I've had questions in the past about like, oh, well, how much oil is too much oil? I mean, I would, if you're comparing this to a meat, any plant-based oil like a grapeseed oil is better for you than an animal-based fat. So, if you're trying to go light on oil, an alternative could be to try to cook some of this jackfruit with a little bit of vegetable broth until it gets like nice and soft and pliable and really starts to break down, and then hit it with oil closer to the end to just help crisp it. That's another technique. But the oil, the veggie broth, I find like kind of once it dries out, it just looks really dry, the jackfruit. So because it doesn't have any of that fat, you really do need to add some oil to it. So let's take a look at how our salsa is doing. So you can see here that I have a simmer going. I'm going to set the camera down. And I just want to give it a nice little mix. And it's actually still, the texture here is still pretty loose, which is what I'm looking for. I don't want it to be too thick, but this texture seems to be, and you can see that it's already started to cook down. So you can see here on the side of my pot that it's probably cooked down at least a ½ inch there. So it is reducing. And when you reduce something, you definitely increase flavor because it just pretty much concentrates the flavor of whatever you have cooking down. So I'm going to let that cook for just another few minutes. I'm going to give it a quick taste just to make sure it doesn't need anything else as it's been cooking. Now the flavors are going to be different because remember we had raw tomato, raw onion, raw garlic. So those flavors were really strong. when I tasted it earlier for salt. And now that we have some time that it's been cooking, I just want to give it another taste to make sure that it's all good. Yeah, and right now, the tomatoes are really, really shining here. And I feel in the back note, that chile de árbol, which is more of a mild chile that gives a little bit of body to the salsa. And then I feel the little kick of the chile de árbol. So again, if you wanted any more of that spicy kick, you know that you can add more of those chiles. All right, and the last thing I'll do is I'm going to just break down, let me get some of these citrus out of the way. I'm just gonna break down my beans. I'm gonna hand blend those, and then we're gonna start to work on assembling our torta. Any questions right now as I kind of just make sure everything's working okay and kind of get my space organized again.
Where did you get your apron?
This apron I actually got from Headley and Bennett. It's just like a linen apron that I wear mostly at home. And then we have some Todo Verde aprons that we sell too. Like this one's more like, just like, it almost feels like pajamas, like just loose, comfortable. And then we have some more structured ones with Todo Verde. Let me show you this one. This is like the next one I like to use after the one I'm wearing. Actually, like this is my favorite. And then today I just felt like wearing this one because of my dress. But we also have our Todo Verde aprons available in our shop as well too. And so this is like a nice denim and it has pockets and it has adjustable straps. All right, so I love using an Instapot. I need to try to partner with them actually and be like, we need to make some recipes together. Cause I got it a while ago and I was like, I don't really know how that machine works too much. There's like a lot of buttons going on. And I hadn't really used it. And then during this COVID-19 era, I started to just use it to make more like rice, beans, things like that. But there's a variety of different things that you can make in it, from like yogurt to stews and things that will really, really cook and meld together over a very short period of time. So for example, I made these pinto beans. I'm gonna just pull out the bay leaves that are in here. And I just added to these beans some, I added some water, chipotle, a dried chipotle chile. I added some dried mushrooms, a little bit of cumin, some salt, pepper, some bay leaves that I just pulled out. Just a really simple, I thought I had an avocado leaf that I thought I had one left, but I think I had used it already, but you could add an avocado leaf in here. So many things that you can add to flavor your beans. And it has just the right amount of broth for me to just use the hand blender to blend these up. And believe it or not, this pot of beans, without pre-soaking, just literally dry beans straight out of the glass container that I have them in, into the Instapot, cooked in about 40 minutes. So no soaking overnight. You just put dried beans in there, some water, whatever else you want to season it, you set the machine, and it's like good to go in about 40 minutes, which is crazy. But I love it. It works so well.
We just did like 20 minutes dried beans as well just now, like when the class started, and
yeah.
I just put it out right now and it's perfect.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, it depends on the bean. Like I last week did tepary beans, and those took a little bit longer, but it's so easy. I mean, they could be done even faster, but I put the 36-minute setting, and then it takes a few minutes for it to like pressurize. But it's a game changer, y'all. If you don't have one, you should really, really consider getting one. It just makes your time in the kitchen so much more effortless. Okay, and so I just have my hand blender here. You saw it's my whole beans, and all I'm gonna do is just blend them up with my hand blender until I get a nice smooth consistency. I probably maybe should have taken a little bit of that liquid out, but what I could do, no, it's gonna be fine. It's gonna be a nice smooth consistency. But if that ever does happen to you, you could, I don't know if you can hear me. If that ever does happen to you where it's too much water ratio to your beans and you do this, you could always just throw them in a pot and let them slightly reduce down on low temperature. All right. So I have a pretty smooth consistency. All right, so I'm pretty good to go here. And I'll show you overhead in a second what this looks like. So you can see here that I have a nice smooth consistency. I like my beans to be really smooth like this rather than like chunky. But again, this is personal preference. So these beans are gonna be slightly runny, but I don't mind because this dish generally is a very messy one. Like if you get it in Mexico or some of these places in East LA, you're typically gonna get a plate lined in a plastic bag with your torta ahogada over it because it's messy. And you know, they're trying to not get too deep into the whole washing dishes situation. And so that's the way that you'll typically find your torta ahogada. So I am going to, but again, if you wanted this to be like right now, if I'm like, oh, I made a mistake, it's too runny, just put this in a pot, add some on like a very low heat and let it just slightly reduce down. It'll take a little bit, maybe even medium heat if you're keeping your eye on it and like mixing it, because then you don't want the bottom to burn. Which is why the low heat just kind of does a slow and low and lets it kind of reduce down. All right. So let's get ready to start assembling here. Let me get these out of the way. And the other thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just put my sauce here out of the way. I'm just gonna put it on this cutting board I have here. Just get it out of the way. And one thing that's traditional for tortas ahogadas is to use a bread called birote salado. And what a birote salado is, so, you know, you let me know if folks have, you know, eaten tortas ahogadas, whether you call the bread birote or you call the bread bolillo. But essentially what it is it's all coming from like a French style of making bread. And it's a small roll. And I actually picked up bread this morning from La Monarca, which is the bakery that is close to me. But you can get it at your favorite local Mexican bakery. But this one is a bolillo and it's a little bit soft to the touch. A birote salado is a very traditional way. I was like, I don't have like the you know, because of COVID to like go out of my way to get the birote salado. I was like, I'm just gonna make do with what I have nearby, which is fine. But the way the birote salado is it's not really soft. It's more of like a crunchy, crispy outside of the bolillo, and it gets like nice and crispy. And so as it bakes, and that way when you add the salsa over it, it doesn't get as soggy. And so one way that you can avoid that is if you had, you know, this bolillo that I have, which is pretty soft, you can put this in an oven. So you can, you know, put the two sides down in a baking sheet in the oven and let that toast a little bit and let it get a little bit crispy, knowing that when you add the sauce over it, it's going to soften up again, but it's going to hold up a little bit more to the sauce. Right now, I have a cast iron
that I'm just going to use to toast the inside a little bit. And so it's up to you how you want to toast, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to use my stovetop to just toast the inside of the bread, a little bit of the top, but if you use an oven, you'll get even more toasting happening on the top of your bread as well. So let me go ahead and get that started. I'm trying to switch my AirPod to the other one because the first one died. Hopefully it connects right now. All right, it is connecting. All right, so I have this comal that is heating up. Turn up the heat slightly. I'm going to put my bread down. I put it open side down, and I want to get a little bit of toastiness on it. This is actually how I toast my bread. I don't have a toaster. So anytime I do eat bread, that's what I do. And I just want to get a little bit of toastiness on there, just so that, you know, as I add my beans, as I add the sauce, it holds up a little bit more. And so that's just one thing you should do if you have this just regular bolillo. But again, if you have a birote salado on hand, I don't know if anybody does, that's a whole other story. You already have this like really crispy outside with the soft inside. And then you can see here, I already turned my jackfruit down pretty low, and it has this really nice browning that's happened. So my jackfruit at this point is more like my preferred jackfruit. So this is going to be perfect for filling my torta. Any questions as we wait for the final assembly here? Everyone's like, no, I'm just ready to eat. Let me bring you over more closely here with my phone to look at this sauce. So you want a sauce that has a little bit of that runniness, that it's going to get soaked up by your bread. And then, but also one that has like, I like a little bit of texture in here with the tomato. And one that doesn't feel too thick. It's like just the right consistency, not too thick, not too thin of a sauce. See how this bread is looking here. I'm starting to get a little bit of browning here. I'm going to just turn it on the other side to make sure it's browning pretty evenly. All right, and let me get my plate, which is like what I'm going to use to piece it all together, which is actually going to be kind of small for my birote. Flip this one over. That one had a nice toasty bottom. And I don't have a bread knife here at home. I have our bread knives at the kitchen, but obviously I'm at home right now, I'm not at our kitchen. And we don't actually use a lot of bread generally with todo verde. It's like every once in a while we'll make tortas for a special order, but it's very rare. And so what I did is I asked the La Monaca, the bakery that I just bought this at, if they could slice the bread for me. So you can ask the bakery; they'll definitely have a bread knife. Because sometimes, especially if the bread is a little bit soft, you might find that it's hard to slice through with a regular knife. You need that serrated edge to really help break it down. So I'm just trying to get a little bit of toastiness here on the other side. I turned off the heat already. This cast iron holds heat really well, so it's really hot. And as I do that top on there, I'm just going to bring the bottom of my birote to my plate, and I'm going to start layering in my frijoles. So I can come to this camera here and start kind of piecing it all together. So I have that, and let me get a spoon of my frijoles. So these beans are just the way I like them. They're smooth, they're luscious. And it's gonna be nice and messy. And this is something that you could eat with your hands, this dish. I've seen people eat it with a fork and knife. No matter what, it's gonna get messy. I can tell you that, that's for sure. All right, and then I'm gonna grab some of my carnitas. Let me grab another spoon here. Let me actually grab another spoon. So I'm just grabbing some of my carnitas, and I'm just gonna, my jackfruit carnitas, I should say. And I'm just gonna add that there. There we are. I'm gonna grab my other piece of birote, which has a nice little slight crispy crunch. I got a little blackening happening there, but that's fine. It's gonna get coated with, look at that side, it looks super nice. And then I'm gonna grab a ladle for my salsa. And I'm gonna bring it nice and close here because it's gonna drip. And you can just ladle that sauce. There we go. Over the torta, and it really has to drown it. It has to be a good amount of salsa. There we go. So that's one full ladle that I did. And then the last thing we'll add here is our cebollitas. We shouldn't say cebollitas because people mostly think that's the green one. But we can add here our cebollas. Let me try to grab some from the bottom that have been soaking more deeply in that juice. Take this one out and do a slice. There we go. And there is our torta ahogada. And so here, I missed a spot. So I would even go in and make sure every little last bit, like here, get that nice and coated. But any questions as we're wrapping up here? Just trying to get that last little.
Thank you.
Let me put up the volume here. Go ahead.
What other things, if we ended up with excess of the sauce, could we use it on?
If you ended up with what?
Excess of the sauce, like what else would you recommend using it on? What else could it be used like as an enchilada sauce too?
If you wanted to use it for an enchilada sauce, you'd have to thicken it up using mostly like chiles, you know, to get it to thicken up and coat enchiladas a bit better, because this is more of like a, enchilada sauce typically doesn't have a tomato base like this one does. This would be really good for a sopa de fideo, actually, if you wanted to, if you have the cookbook, I have a sopa de fideo recipe that's in there where you julienne some squash. So you would essentially cut squash in tiritas, like similar to the, you know, to the fideo that we use in sopa de fideo. And you can add that once the sauce is nice and hot, you can add the squash to it and just let it get really soft. And you can eat that as a soup too. You can add vegetable broth to loosen it if you need to. But yeah, you can use it for a variety of other things. It could also be used as a, you know, as a base for other things that you're cooking. Or if you wanted to even put the crispy last bits of your jackfruit together with the tomato sauce, that could be a really nice guisado too.